3 in the morning, fog crawling off the Detroit River. The Packard plant stretches for blocks in the darkness, its broken windows catching whatever light the city still gives. Somewhere inside, water drips from a ceiling that stopped being a ceiling decades ago. Graffiti covers walls that once held blueprints for luxury automobiles. Trees grow through concrete floors where 40,000 workers once punched in at dawn. This was the largest abandoned factory in the world. 3.5 million square feet, 80 buildings spread across 80 acres. Designed by the same architect who built Ford's empire. And for 50 years, it sat here rotting, a cathedral of rust in the heart of what was once the richest manufacturing city on earth. Detroit didn't just lose factories, it lost something harder to name, a faith in what work could become. How does a city that invented the modern world forget how to live in it? The question matters because the answer isn't simple. It never is with places like this. Every rusted beam, every collapsed roof, every shattered window tells a piece of a story that stretches back more than a century. To understand what happened here, you have to understand what Detroit was before it became a symbol of decline. And what it was unprecedented. In the early years of the 20th century, Detroit wasn't yet the Motor City. It was a manufacturing hub, yes, but mostly for things like stoves, iron ore, pharmaceuticals. The population hovered around 300,000, large by the standards of 1900, unremarkable by what was coming. Then came the machines. The very first Packard automobile rolled off a line in Warren, Ohio, on November 6, 1899. It was built by brothers James and William Packard, who believed they could construct a better horseless carriage than the ones available at the time. They were right. The early Packards earned a reputation for quality that attracted wealthy buyers and, more importantly, wealthy investors. One of those investors was Henry Joy, a Detroit businessman who was so impressed by his Packard that he organized a group of associates to buy into the company. In 1903, they moved operations from Ohio to Detroit, where suppliers of wheels, carriages, engines, tires, and paint were already clustered. The city had infrastructure, it had labor, it had ambition. And it had Albert Kahn. Kahn was an architect, German-born, who understood something that would reshape industrial construction forever. Traditional factories were cramped, dark, supported by wooden columns that limited floor space. Kahn's innovation was reinforced concrete, a method of construction that allowed for wider spans, more natural light, and buildings that could grow alongside demand. The Packard plant was his proving ground. Construction began in 1903 on 40 acres along Grand Boulevard. The first 9 buildings were traditional, brick and timber. But by 1906, Kahn added Building 10, the first reinforced concrete factory building in Detroit's automobile industry. It became the template for every factory that followed. By 1908, the Packard plant had expanded to 6 times its original size. Skilled craftsmen from over 80 different trades worked inside. At its peak, the plant employed 40,000 people. They built cars that Hollywood stars and presidents drove. A 1912 Packard took 2 months to produce. The wood used in its body had been cured in open air for a year before touching a saw. Painting involved dozens of coats of varnish, primer, and color, each sanded by hand. The quality was reflected in the price. When an average Michigan car cost around $1,100, a Packard cost more than 3 times that. And Packard was just the beginning. The success of Packard drew others to Detroit like moths to a flame. Within a few years, the city became the undisputed center of American automobile manufacturing. By 1904, there were 17 automakers operating within the city limits, employing 6,000 workers, producing 12,000 cars a year. Michigan alone produced half the cars made in the entire country. The draw was obvious. Detroit had suppliers. It had skilled labor, workers who understood machining and metalwork from decades of manufacturing stoves and carriages. It had access to raw materials via the Great Lakes shipping routes. And it had a culture of experimentation, a willingness to try new things that more established cities had lost. Ransom E. Olds had opened the first automobile manufacturing plant in Detroit in 1899, the same year the Packard brothers built their first car in Ohio. Olds pioneered the concept of interchangeable parts, making repairs easier and production faster. His curved-dash Oldsmobile became the first mass-produced automobile, years before Ford's Model T. But Olds left Detroit after disagreements with his investors. The company that bore his name eventually became part of General Motors. The plant he built was repurposed, expanded, and eventually demolished. The man who showed that mass production was possible received little credit for his innovations. Such was the nature of Detroit's automotive industry. Ideas spread faster than credit. What one company invented, another improved upon. The collective intelligence of the city exceeded any individual genius, though individual geniuses received most of the fame. William Durant founded General Motors in 1908, the same year Ford introduced the Model T. Durant's strategy was accumulation. He bought Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and dozens of smaller companies, assembling a portfolio of brands that covered every price point. Where Ford offered one car in one color, Durant offered variety. The approaches were philosophically opposed. Ford believed in simplicity and scale. Durant believed in diversity and acquisition. Both men built empires. Both empires transformed the city. And both men eventually lost control of what they had created. Durant was forced out of General Motors in 1920, victim of a financial crisis that nearly destroyed the company. He spent his final years running a bowling alley in Flint. Ford held on to his company longer, but watched his son Edsel die in 1943 and his empire calcify around principles that had become obsolete. The men who built Detroit's automotive industry rarely enjoyed the cities they created. Their eyes were always on the next factory, the next production record, the next $1 billion. The city that made them was a tool, not a home. Perhaps that's why it was so easy to leave. 2 miles northwest of the Packard plant, Henry Ford was about to change everything. Ford had failed before. His first company, the Detroit Automobile Company, produced exactly 2 cars before going under in 1901. His second venture, the Henry Ford Company, collapsed after disagreements with investors. The investors renamed it Cadillac. But Ford learned from his failures. In 1903, he founded Ford Motor Company with a dozen investors, including the Dodge brothers, who manufactured precision engine and chassis components. The early Fords sold well, but Ford wanted more than well. He wanted everyone. In September 1907, Ford purchased 130 acres in Highland Park, Michigan. He hired Albert Kahn to design something the world had never seen, a factory purpose-built for mass production. The Highland Park plant opened on January 1, 1910. Kahn used reinforced concrete and walls of glass that stretched toward the sky. Workers called it the Crystal Palace. The extra light made for a more pleasant work environment. It also allowed Ford's engineers to see exactly how work flowed across the floor. For 3 years they watched, they measured, they optimized. Then on October 7, 1913, they changed history. The moving assembly line for automobiles was first operated at Highland Park on that date. Before the line, a single Model T took over 12 hours to assemble. Workers moved from car to car, performing the same tasks at different stations. It was slow, it was inconsistent, it was expensive. The assembly line flipped the equation. Instead of workers moving to cars moved to workers. Each person performed one task, then pushed the chassis down the line to the next. The result was staggering. Assembly time dropped from over 12 hours to 93 minutes. 93 minutes. The implications were almost impossible to grasp at the time. Assembly time that had measured in days now measured in minutes. Skilled craftsmen who had spent years learning their trade were replaced by workers who could be trained in hours. The artisan economy that had defined manufacturing for centuries was swept away by something faster, cheaper, and fundamentally different. Ford understood what he had created, even if the world took years to catch up. In a 1922 interview, he explained his philosophy with characteristic bluntness. I invented nothing new. I simply assembled into a car the discoveries of other men behind whom were centuries of work. The assembly line wasn't invention, it was organization. It was the recognition that complex tasks could be broken into simple steps, each step optimized, each worker specialized, the whole becoming greater than the sum of its parts. Other industries had used assembly line techniques before. Meatpackers in Chicago had developed disassembly lines that moved carcasses past workers who each performed a single cut. Canneries, breweries, and armories used similar principles. Ford's contribution was applying those principles to something as complex as an automobile, with thousands of parts and dozens of systems that had to work together. The result was unprecedented productivity and unprecedented human cost. Workers on the line became extensions of the machinery they served. The pace was set by the line itself, not by the workers' judgment or endurance. Those who couldn't keep up were replaced. Those who could keep up often broke down eventually, their bodies worn out by repetitive motion, their minds numbed by the monotony. Ford addressed part of this problem with the $5 day, but money couldn't compensate for everything. The turnover rate at Highland Park in 1913, before the wage increase, was 370% annually. Workers quit faster than Ford could hire them. The line was efficient at producing cars. It was also efficient at consuming human beings. The wage increase helped. Turnover dropped to around 15% by 1915. Workers who had been transient became permanent. They bought houses. They started families. They began to see factory work not as a temporary expedient, but as a career. And Detroit grew to accommodate them. The price of a Model T dropped from $850 in 1909 to $260 by 1925. Suddenly, the automobile wasn't a luxury for the wealthy. It was transportation for everyone. Ford's workforce exploded. By 1925, nearly 70,000 people worked at Highland Park, but Ford was already thinking bigger. The Crystal Palace, revolutionary as it was, couldn't contain his vision. He needed something else, something that had never existed before. The River Rouge complex began as a bird sanctuary. In 1915, Henry Ford purchased 2,000 acres of swampland along the Rouge River, southwest of Detroit, with the intention of building a nature preserve. That changed near the end of World War I when the federal government asked Ford to produce Eagle boats for the Navy. Ford agreed. The sanctuary became a shipyard. And then it became something that defied description. Between 1917 and 1928, the Rouge grew into the largest integrated factory in the world. It measured 1.5 miles wide by 1 mile long, 93 buildings, 16 million square feet of factory floor space, 100 miles of interior railroad track, 27 miles of conveyors, 53,000 machine tools. Ford's goal was complete vertical integration, total control over every step of production from raw material to finished automobile. He bought iron mines in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He acquired timberland. He built ore boats that brought materials down the Great Lakes to the Rouge's own docks. Raw ore arrived at one end of the complex. Finished cars rolled out the other. At its peak in the 1930s, more than 100,000 people worked at the Rouge. They smelted over 6,000 tons of iron every day. They produced 500 tons of glass. A new car came off the assembly line every 49 seconds. To keep all of this running required a maintenance crew of 5,000 workers just to clean the buildings and grounds. When they finished, they started again. The Rouge had its own fire department, its own hospital, its own police force, its own power plant that could light a city the size of Detroit. It was, in every meaningful sense, a city without residents. To visit the Rouge was to witness the future. Tours began in 1924 and continued for decades, hosting approximately 1 million visitors per year at their peak. Families drove from across the country to see the wonder of it all, the blast furnaces turning ore into iron, the foundries casting engine blocks, the assembly lines stretching into infinity, the gleaming new automobiles rolling off at a rate of 1 every 49 seconds. Foreign dignitaries came to study and copy. Soviet engineers visited in the 1920s, sent by Stalin to learn American manufacturing techniques. They went home and built imitations, applying Ford's methods to tractors and tanks. The Rouge became a template for industrial development worldwide, its principles translated into factories on every continent. Charlie Chaplin visited and studied the Rouge before making Modern Times, his 1936 masterpiece about the dehumanizing effects of industrialization. The film's famous scene of Chaplin being swallowed by factory gears drew directly from what he had seen in Dearborn. The comedy was dark because the reality was darker. But the men who worked the lines didn't see comedy. They saw necessity. The wages Ford paid were the best in the industry, enough to buy a house and raise a family and save for the future. The work was hard, but what work wasn't? The alternative was poverty, unemployment, the desperate scramble of the unskilled labor market. The Rouge offered certainty in an uncertain world. Clock in, do your job, clock out, collect your pay. There was dignity in that, even if there wasn't much fulfillment. A man could support his family. He could see the results of his labor rolling off the line, tangible evidence that his hours meant something. And so the workers came, from across America and around the world. They came from the farms of the Midwest and the cities of the East. They came from Poland and Italy, from Greece and Lebanon, from the American South, black workers fleeing Jim Crow for the promise of equal wages and steady work. Ford Motor Company became one of the largest private employers of African Americans in the country. The company hired black workers when other manufacturers would not, partly from conviction, partly from calculation. Black workers were less likely to organize unions. They were grateful for opportunities denied elsewhere. Their presence divided the workforce along racial lines, which served management's interests. The mathematics of production required bodies. The Rouge consumed labor the way its blast furnaces consumed iron ore, and as long as the cars kept rolling and the wages kept flowing, most workers accepted the bargain. Diego Rivera visited the Rouge in 1932, commissioned by Edsel Ford to paint a series of murals for the Detroit Institute of Arts. He spent a month studying the machines and the men who operated them. The murals he created, Detroit Industry, remain among the most important works of American art. They capture something essential, the scale of what Ford had built, the relentless precision, and the human cost hidden in every gear. Because there was a cost, there always is. The assembly line was efficient, it was also brutal. Work at the Rouge was hot, loud, and dangerous. The pace never stopped. Workers performed the same motions thousands of times per day, their bodies becoming extensions of the machines they served. Injuries were common. Repetitive strain destroyed joints and spines. The summer heat inside the foundry could reach 120 degrees. And if you complained, you were replaced. Henry Ford famously raised wages to $5 a day in 1914, more than double what most factory workers earned. The announcement made international headlines. Workers flooded into Detroit from across the country, looking for a chance at the middle class. But the $5 day came with strings. To qualify, workers had to submit to inspections of their homes and personal lives by Ford's sociological department. Inspectors checked whether employees drank alcohol, gambled, or lived in housing that met Ford's standards. Immigrants had to attend classes to become Americanized. At graduation ceremonies, workers dressed in their national clothing would walk into a symbolic melting pot and emerge dressed in identical American suits. Ford believed he was civilizing his workforce. His workers experienced it as surveillance. By the 1930s, the surveillance turned violent. Ford hired Harry Bennett, a former boxer and ex-Navy man, to run the service department, a private security force that patrolled the Rouge with the authority of police and none of the accountability. Bennett's men monitored workers for union sympathies, beat organizers, and enforced discipline through intimidation. On May 26, 1937, members of the United Auto Workers attempted to hand out pamphlets near the Rouge's Gate 4. Bennett's men attacked them. Union organizers Walter Reuther and Richard Frankenstein were beaten bloody while photographers captured the assault. The Battle of the Overpass, as it became known, turned public opinion against Ford and accelerated the UAW's campaign. It took until 1941 for the Union to be formally recognized at the Rouge. By then, the world was at war. The victory came slowly and at enormous cost. Workers who attempted to organize faced surveillance, harassment, and violence. Bennett's service department maintained files on suspected Union sympathizers. Men were fired for attending meetings, beaten for distributing pamphlets, blacklisted for speaking up. But the movement couldn't be stopped. The Depression had radicalized workers across the country. The Roosevelt administration's New Deal legislation, particularly the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, gave unions legal protections they had never had before. And the example of successful organizing at other plants, particularly the sit-down strikes at GM's facilities in Flint, showed that the automakers could be beaten. The UAW's campaign at Ford was long and bitter. The Battle of the Overpass was only the most famous confrontation. There were countless smaller incidents, firings, beatings, intimidation campaigns that played out across years. Harry Bennett ran the service department like a military operation, and the union responded with military discipline of its own. When the union finally won recognition in 1941, it was through an election that Ford lost decisively. Workers voted for the UAW by a margin of more than 90%. The man who had built the company, who had revolutionized manufacturing, who had become one of the richest men in the world, had lost the support of the people who made his cars. Ford signed the UAW contract on June 20, 1941. Less than 6 months later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and everything changed again. World War II transformed Detroit overnight. The automobile plant stopped producing cars and started producing weapons. Ford built the Willow Run bomber plant, where B-24 Liberators rolled off the line one every hour. The Rouge manufactured jeeps, aircraft engines, tank armor, and the Packard V1650 Merlin engine that powered the P-51 Mustang fighter. Employment soared. Workers who had been laid off during the Depression suddenly found themselves in high demand. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. African Americans migrated from the South in search of jobs and dignity, continuing the Great Migration that had been reshaping Detroit's demographics since World War I. Between 1940 and 1950, Detroit's population grew from just over 1.5 million to over 1.8 million. The city became the fifth largest in America. The future seemed limitless. The war had proven something important. Detroit could adapt. The same assembly lines that produced Model Ts and Packards could be retooled for bombers and tanks. The same workers who had learned to be efficient could apply that efficiency to whatever the nation needed. This adaptability became a source of pride. Detroit wasn't just the Motor City. It was the arsenal of democracy, a phrase Roosevelt used that captured something essential about the city's self-image. Detroit made things, important things, things that won wars and built futures. The workers who survived the Depression and the war felt they had earned their place. The UAW had won recognition. Wages were rising. Pensions and health benefits, once unthinkable luxuries, were becoming standard. The middle class that Detroit had helped create was expanding, and factory workers were at its center. For many families, the 1950s represented a kind of culmination. A house in the suburbs, a car in the garage, children in good schools, a pension waiting at the end of a career, the American dream, mass-produced like everything else in Detroit. But the dream had limits, and the cracks that would destroy it were already visible to those who looked closely. But the cracks were already forming. Even before the war ended, the forces that would unravel Detroit were gathering strength. The factories that had grown up in the city center, like the Packard plant and the Highland Park plant, were aging. Their multi-story layouts, once innovative, now seemed inefficient compared to the sprawling single-story plants being built on cheaper land outside the city. Henry Ford died in 1947. The man who had built the Rouge was gone. His company and his city would never be the same. The exodus began quietly. In 1950, 56% of all automobile manufacturing jobs in the United States were in Michigan. Most of those were in Detroit and its immediate suburbs. The city controlled its industry the way a heart controls the body. By 1960, that share had fallen to 40%. The reasons were practical. Modern assembly lines required horizontal space. Building new factories on farmland outside the city was cheaper than retrofitting aging plants downtown. Workers followed the jobs, and suburbanization provided an escape from urban congestion. The old factories, the ones that had made Detroit great, were designed for a different era. The Packard plant, with its multi-story buildings and bridges between structures, represented the cutting edge of 1903. By 1953, it was obsolete. Modern assembly lines wanted single-story buildings where materials could flow horizontally without the complexity of elevators and conveyors between floors. Ford had understood this early. The Rouge was mostly single-story, sprawling rather than vertical. GM and Chrysler learned the same lesson and built their new facilities accordingly. But the learning happened outside Detroit's city limits, on cheaper land where taxes were lower and regulations fewer. The post-war boom accelerated the dispersion. Factories that once clustered downtown now spread across the metropolitan area, connected by highways that let workers commute from ever greater distances. The workers followed the jobs followed cheap land, and the city that had incubated the industry watched it spread beyond its reach. Between 1947 and 1958, the city of Detroit lost nearly 135,000 manufacturing jobs. They didn't disappear. They moved to the suburbs, where new plants rose on former farmland, where property taxes were lower, where workers could live in houses with yards instead of cramped urban apartments. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of black workers to Detroit during and after the war. They came seeking the same things white workers sought: steady wages, dignity, a chance to build something better for their families. What they found was more complicated. But there was another reason, one that newspapers of the time rarely mentioned directly. Detroit in the 1940s and 1950s was one of the most segregated cities in America. Redlining prevented black families from obtaining mortgages in white neighborhoods. Real estate agents refused to show houses across color lines. Homeowners associations formed specifically to keep black residents out. When African Americans attempted to move into white areas, they faced violence. The housing market for black Detroiters was deliberately constrained. Landlords charged higher rents for worse housing because they could. Overcrowding became endemic in neighborhoods like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, communities that had vibrant cultural and commercial life, but were starved of investment and city services. Then came the highways. In the name of urban renewal, Detroit demolished Black Bottom and Paradise Valley to make way for Interstate 375 and other freeways. Thousands of families were displaced. The housing shortage worsened, and the highways that replaced those neighborhoods made it easier for white residents to flee to the suburbs while still working in the city. Between 1950 and 1960, Detroit lost almost 20% of its population. The white exodus was only beginning. The numbers told a stark story. In 1940, Detroit was 90% white and 9% black. By 1970, it would be 56% white and 44% black. The transformation happened in a single generation, driven by policies and practices that were deliberate even when they weren't explicitly stated. White families who moved to the suburbs often explained their departure in terms of space, safety, and schools. They wanted bigger houses. They wanted neighborhoods where they felt comfortable. They wanted their children in classrooms that weren't overcrowded. What they meant, often without saying it directly, was that they wanted to live away from black people. The Federal Housing Administration made this possible. FHA mortgage insurance, which opened homeownership to millions of Americans after the war, was systematically denied to black applicants and to white applicants who wanted to buy in mixed neighborhoods. The agency's underwriting manuals explicitly linked racial integration with declining property values. Veterans returning from World War II found that the GI Bill's promises applied unevenly. White veterans could buy homes in new suburban developments. Black veterans were steered to urban neighborhoods where housing was older, more crowded, and more expensive relative to quality. The result was a dual housing market that enriched white families and impoverished black ones. White homeownership rates soared in the post-war years. Black families, denied access to the same opportunities, remained renters or bought in neighborhoods that banks had written off. As white residents left for the suburbs, they took their tax dollars with them. The city's revenue base shrank even as its responsibilities grew. Services deteriorated, schools struggled. The city that had been among the wealthiest in America began its long slide into insolvency. The east side of Detroit alone lost over 70,000 jobs in the decade following World War II. The Packard plant, which had been the largest and most advanced automobile factory in the world when it opened, was among the first casualties. Packard struggled after the war. Its luxury market had been eroded by Cadillac and Lincoln. Its attempt to compete in the mid-price range collided with the established power of the Big Three: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. In 1954, Packard merged with Studebaker in a desperate bid for survival. The merged company never turned a profit. In 1956, the last true Packard rolled off the line at Grand Boulevard. 11,000 workers lost their jobs in a single day. The plant didn't close entirely. Half of it was leased to various companies for manufacturing and warehousing, limping along for decades. But the grandeur was gone. The precision craftsmen who had spent months building a single car were scattered. The name itself was discontinued in 1958. By 1999, the city evicted the remaining tenants in preparation for demolition. A legal battle ensued, and the city lost its claim to ownership. With no tenants and disputed title, the abandoned structure began its long decay. Scrappers arrived first. They stripped copper wiring from the walls, sold metal fixtures for salvage, pulled anything of value from a building that had once produced over 1.6 million luxury automobiles. Arson followed. The Packard plant became so routinely on fire that someone created a website tracking whether it was burning at any given moment. For 60 years, the plant stood as what one mayor called a source of national embarrassment. The largest abandoned factory in the world, visible from the freeway, impossible to ignore. Demolition finally began in 2022, funded in part by pandemic relief money. By December 2024, most of the 3.5 million square feet had been reduced to rubble. 2 structures remain standing, their fate uncertain. What replaces them may eventually matter. What was lost already does. The Packard plant was more than a factory. It was a symbol of what Detroit could accomplish when ambition and craftsmanship aligned. The cars it produced were works of art as much as machines. The workers who made them took pride in their product. A Packard meant something. When that meaning died, something in Detroit died with it. The workers who lost their jobs in 1956 scattered across the region. Some found work at other plants, some retired, some never recovered. The community that had formed around the plant, the bars and restaurants and churches that served Packard workers, withered as well. A factory isn't just a building. It's a network of relationships, economic and social, that radiates outward into the surrounding community. When the factory closes, those relationships break. The barbershop that cut workers' hair loses customers. The diner that served lunch loses patrons. The landlord who rented apartments loses tenants. Multiply that across dozens of factories, across decades, and you begin to understand what happened to Detroit. Packard was the first to fall. It wasn't the last. The Dodge main plant in Hamtramck, which employed over 30,000 workers at its peak, reduced its workforce to a few thousand before closing entirely in 1980. The Hudson Motor Car Company factory, once one of the largest in the world, was demolished in 1954. The Fisher Body plant on Piquette Avenue, where Cadillac's first automobiles were built, was abandoned and eventually demolished in 2019. One by one, the temples of industry that had made Detroit the richest manufacturing city on earth fell silent. The Highland Park Ford plant, birthplace of the moving assembly line, fared slightly better. Vehicle production moved to the Rouge in 1927, but Highland Park continued making tractors and, during World War II, Sherman tanks. Ford sold the building in 1981 and began leasing space. Throughout the 1980s, large sections were demolished. What remains is about a third of the original complex, now called the Highland Park Industrial Center, occupied by various tenants. It's a national historic landmark. It changed the world, and most people in Detroit couldn't tell you where to find it. The Rouge survived, though in diminished form. The steel mill and other infrastructure were spun off in 1989. Today, the complex occupies less than half its original footprint and employs about 6,000 workers, a shadow of the 100,000 who once clocked in. But it still produces Ford F-150 trucks. It's still running. When people talk about Detroit's decline, they often speak as if the city simply died. The truth is messier. Detroit didn't die. It hollowed out. The core collapsed while the edges expanded. Suburbs like Warren, Dearborn, and Sterling Heights grew as the city shrank. The factories didn't disappear. They moved. And they took everything with them. Tax revenue, jobs, services, hope. The relationship between Detroit and its suburbs was never harmonious. The 8-mile road that gives its name to Eminem's famous film was more than a geographic boundary. It was a border between worlds. Inside the city, poverty, crime, declining services. Outside, prosperity, safety, functioning schools. White suburban residents who commuted into Detroit for work saw the city's decay as confirmation of their decision to leave. They paid taxes in their home municipalities, used highways built with federal money, and extracted value from a city they had abandoned. The arrangement was economically perverse. Detroit provided infrastructure and services for a metropolitan workforce while collecting taxes from only those who lived within its borders. As more workers moved to the suburbs, the burden on those who remained grew heavier. Property taxes rose. Services declined anyway. The schools that had once educated the children of auto workers became underfunded and overcrowded. Crime increased as poverty spread. And as conditions worsened, more people left, accelerating the spiral. By 1980, Detroit's population had fallen to 1.2 million, down from its peak of 1.8 million in 1950. The city that had been the fifth largest in America was now the sixth, then the seventh, then the 10th. The trajectory was clear even if the bottom wasn't. The factories that remained grew increasingly automated. Robots replaced workers on assembly lines. Computer-controlled machines performed tasks that had once required human judgment. The jobs that survived paid less than the ones that had vanished, and there were fewer of them. The union contracts that had guaranteed middle-class wages for factory workers became targets. Management blamed high labor costs for their inability to compete with Japanese imports. Workers blamed management for decades of mismanagement and failure to invest in quality. Both were right. Both were wrong. The truth was that the industry Detroit had built had outgrown the city that made it possible. By 1960, more white people lived in Detroit's suburbs than in the city itself. The pattern accelerated through the decade. In 1950, Detroit was 84% white. By 1970, that had fallen to 56%. The black population, meanwhile, had grown from about 16% to over 40% of the city's residents. This wasn't natural population shift, it was engineered. Federal housing policies subsidized white home ownership in the suburbs while denying loans to black families. Highways designed to speed commuters from suburban homes to downtown jobs also made it easy to abandon the city entirely. Employers followed their workforce. Tax base followed employers. Detroit's finances depended on a population of at least 750,000. By the time the 1967 uprising occurred, the city was already bleeding residents. What happened in July 1967 finished what economics had started. The spark was a police raid on a Blind Pig, an unlicensed after-hours bar on 12th Street. It was hosting a welcome home party for two veterans returning from Vietnam. Police arrested all 82 patrons, taking longer than expected to process the arrests. By the time they were done, a crowd had gathered. Someone threw a bottle. Within hours, looting and arson had spread across the city. The uprising lasted 5 days. 43 people died, 33 of them African American. Over 1,400 buildings burned. More than 7,000 people were arrested. Property damage, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $300 million. But the real damage was harder to measure. The riot confirmed every fear white Detroiters had about their city. It accelerated the flight to the suburbs. Businesses that had held on through the 1950s and early 1960s now abandoned locations they would never return to. The tax base that had been eroding for years collapsed. Many of the buildings destroyed in 1967 were never rebuilt. Empty lots replaced storefronts, unemployment rose, city services deteriorated, crime increased, and as conditions worsened, more people left, which meant less tax revenue, which meant worse services, which meant more people leaving. The vicious cycle had no natural endpoint. Coleman Young, who became Detroit's first black mayor 6 years after the uprising, would later write that the riot put Detroit on the fast track to economic desolation, mugging the city and making off with incalculable value in jobs, earnings taxes, corporate taxes, retail dollars, sales taxes, mortgages, interest, property taxes, development dollars, investment dollars, tourism dollars, and plain damn money. He wasn't exaggerating. The riot accelerated trends that were already underway, but the acceleration mattered. Companies that had been considering whether to leave the city now left immediately. Families that had been weighing the pros and cons of suburban life now packed their belongings and moved. The psychological impact was as significant as the economic one. Detroit's image, nationally and internationally, changed overnight. The city that had been the Paris of North America became synonymous with urban decay. The association would prove impossible to shake. President Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission to investigate the causes of the 1967 riots in Detroit and other cities. The commission's famous conclusion that America was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, received attention. Its recommendations for addressing segregation and economic inequality did not. Johnson's Great Society programs, already underfunded because of the Vietnam War, were cut further in the aftermath of the riots. the political will for addressing urban poverty evaporated. Law and order became the dominant theme of American politics, and the cities that needed help most became objects of fear rather than compassion. Detroit's police department hired more black officers in the years following the uprising. The state passed fair housing legislation. Some reforms were implemented. But the underlying dynamics, the economic forces driving jobs to the suburbs and beyond, the racial prejudice shaping housing markets, the systematic disinvestment in urban infrastructure continued unchecked. The buildings that burned in 1967 were never rebuilt. The businesses that fled never returned. The population decline accelerated. And the city that had built the American middle class watched as that middle class abandoned it. Detroit elected its first black mayor in 1973. Coleman Young served until 1993, 2 decades during which the city's white population fell by more than half, and its overall population dropped below 1 million. Young was a polarizing figure. To his supporters, he was a tireless advocate for a city that the rest of America had abandoned. To his critics, he was an angry man who deepened racial divisions and drove investment away. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Young inherited a city in crisis. The manufacturing base that had supported Detroit for half a century was collapsing. The big 3 automakers were building new plants in the Sun Belt and overseas, seeking cheaper labor and fewer union complications. Japanese imports were eating into market share that Detroit had considered its birthright. The oil crisis of 1973 delivered a body blow. Gas prices spiked. American consumers, suddenly worried about fuel economy, turned to smaller, more efficient Japanese cars. Detroit's expertise was in large, powerful sedans and muscle cars. When the market demanded something else, the big 3 couldn't deliver. Ford's response was the Pinto, a compact car so poorly designed that its fuel tank was prone to exploding in rear-end collisions. Chevrolet offered the Vega, whose engine self-destructed due to fundamental engineering and metallurgy defects. These were the best that American industry could produce in a hurry. Japanese manufacturers, who had spent decades refining quality control and efficiency, were ready. Toyota and Honda offered reliable, fuel-efficient vehicles at competitive prices. The generation that bought Pintos and Vegas learned a lesson they never forgot. The big 3 had spent decades competing primarily with each other. They understood American consumers as they had existed in the 1950s and 1960s, buyers who wanted big cars with powerful engines, who associated size with status and performance with displacement. The oil crisis shattered those assumptions. But more than assumptions were shattered. The entire business model of the American auto industry was called into question. Detroit's factories were designed to produce large numbers of similar vehicles. Retooling for different models was expensive and slow. The Japanese, who had developed flexible manufacturing systems that could switch between products more easily, had an advantage that took years to understand and longer to address. Meanwhile, the workers who had powered Detroit's rise were aging. The pension obligations and health care costs that the big 3 had promised during fat years became crushing burdens during lean ones. Every retired worker was a cost without corresponding production. As the workforce shrank and the retiree population grew, the math became increasingly unsustainable. GM, which had been the largest corporation in the world in the 1960s, began a long slide that would eventually lead to bankruptcy. Ford struggled with quality issues and management turmoil. Chrysler, always the weakest of the 3, required a federal bailout in 1979, a harbinger of things to come. The bailout kept Chrysler alive. It also established a precedent that would be invoked 30 years later, when the entire industry teetered on the edge of collapse. The government had shown it was willing to save Detroit's automakers. The automakers learned that failure didn't have to be fatal. Whether that lesson was good or bad depends on who's telling the story. The really bad Detroit cars of the late 1970s and early 1980s launched a cycle that proved nearly impossible to break. Poor design led to reliability problems. Reliability problems led to customer dissatisfaction. Dissatisfied customers bought foreign cars. Lost sales meant lost revenue. Lost revenue meant fewer resources for developing better vehicles, and the cycle repeated. By the time GM and Ford began producing cars that matched Japanese quality in the 1990s and 2000s, the damage was done. A generation of Americans believed, not without reason, that Detroit couldn't build a reliable car. Every good vehicle off a Big Three line had to compete against that reputation. Some marketing executives called it the quality gap. It wasn't a gap, it was a crater. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the automakers responded by cutting costs. They closed plants. They outsourced parts production. They shifted manufacturing to Mexico and Canada, where labor was cheaper. They automated wherever possible, replacing workers with robots that didn't need health insurance or pensions. Detroit proper hemorrhaged jobs. The city that once employed a majority of Michigan's auto workers now employed a fraction. Factories that remained were increasingly staffed by suburban residents who commuted in and commuted out, spending their wages elsewhere. The city's population continued to fall, 1 million in 1990, 950,000 in 2000, 713,000 in 2010, a 25% drop in a single decade. And then the world economy collapsed. The Great Recession of 2008 was a global phenomenon, but it hit Detroit with particular force. The city's economy, despite decades of diversification efforts, remained tied to the fortunes of the auto industry. When auto sales collapsed, Detroit collapsed with them. In the first months of the crisis, auto sales fell by 40%. Factories that had been running 3 shifts cut back to 1 or closed entirely. Suppliers who depended on the Big Three for orders faced bankruptcy themselves. The entire supply chain, from raw materials to dealerships, seized up. The human cost was immediate. Workers who had survived previous downturns, who had watched colleagues laid off and rehired over decades, now faced permanent displacement. The factories weren't closing temporarily. They were closing forever. The jobs they offered would never return. Whole neighborhoods that had depended on auto industry wages saw their economic foundations collapse. Homes that had been investments became liabilities. Families that had expected to retire comfortably faced foreclosure. The wealth that generations of Detroit workers had accumulated evaporated. The bailout that followed was controversial from the start. Critics argued that the government had no business saving private companies from the consequences of their own mismanagement. Supporters argued that the alternative, the liquidation of GM and Chrysler, and the cascade of bankruptcies that would follow, would have destroyed what remained of American manufacturing. Both sides had points, neither had complete answers. The financial crisis of 2008 hit Detroit like a second earthquake in a city still recovering from the first. Credit markets froze, consumer spending plummeted, auto sales, which depend on available financing, collapsed. By the end of 2008, General Motors was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate. Chrysler was days from insolvency. In December 2008, the CEOs of GM and Chrysler flew to Washington to beg for government help. They were excoriated for arriving in private jets while asking for taxpayer money. It was bad optics for a dying industry. The Bush administration provided emergency loans of $13.4 billion in late December, enough to keep the companies alive through the winter. The Obama administration, which took office in January 2009, forced a reckoning. Rick Wagoner, CEO of General Motors, was forced out. Chrysler was told to merge with Italian automaker Fiat or face liquidation. Both companies were pushed into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the same process that had dissolved Packard half a century earlier. The bankruptcy proceedings were extraordinary. Nearly $80 billion in TARP funds flowed to the auto industry. GM emerged from bankruptcy in July 2009, majority owned by the United States Treasury. Chrysler emerged as a subsidiary of Fiat, with the United Auto Workers holding a significant stake. Entire brands vanished. Pontiac, which had been producing cars since 1926, was eliminated. Saturn, Hummer, and Saab were sold or shuttered. The Big Three became the surviving three, leaner but diminished. And the cost to taxpayers? When the Treasury sold its final GM stake in December 2013, the total loss on the auto bailout was approximately $9.3 billion. By the standards of the financial crisis, it was almost a success. Banks that had caused the crash were bailed out and made whole. The automakers who had built bad cars for decades took a loss. Economists still debate whether the bailout was worth it. Supporters point to the million-plus jobs saved across the supply chain, the communities that would have been devastated by mass unemployment, the stabilization of an industry that remains significant to the American economy. Critics point to the moral hazard of saving companies from the consequences of failure. the subsidies effectively transferred to union workers at the expense of competing employers, the precedent set for future bailouts. What's clear is that the bailout saved GM and Chrysler as companies. Whether it saved the communities that depended on them is another question. The factories that survived became leaner, more automated, less reliant on human labor. The jobs that remained paid less than those that had vanished. The union contracts that once guaranteed middle-class wages were renegotiated, with new hires earning significantly less than veteran workers doing the same jobs. Detroit proper saw little benefit from the industry's survival. The factories were mostly in the suburbs now. The workers lived in the suburbs too. The city that had created the auto industry watched its recovery from a distance. And then Detroit itself declared bankruptcy. On July 18, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. $18 to $20 billion in debt, far exceeding the previous record held by Jefferson County, Alabama. The city that had once been the fifth largest in America, home to nearly 2 million people at its peak, was officially insolvent. The filing came after months of deteriorating conditions. Under emergency manager Kevin Orr, appointed by Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, the city stopped making payments on some of its unsecured debts. Orr offered creditors 10 cents on the dollar. Most refused. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney announced that President Obama had no plans to bail out Detroit the way his administration had bailed out the automakers. The city was on its own. For 17 months, lawyers and judges negotiated the impossible. Pensioners who had worked for the city for decades faced cuts to benefits they had been promised. Creditors fought over scraps. Art dealers evaluated whether the Detroit Institute of Arts collection, one of the finest in America, should be sold to pay bondholders. The grand bargain that emerged was imperfect but functional. Foundations and the state of Michigan pledged over $800 million to protect pensions and keep the art collection intact. Retired city workers accepted cuts to their monthly checks and the end of cost of living increases. General creditors received about 20 cents on the dollar. Judge Stephen Rhodes called the agreement miraculous. Detroit emerged from bankruptcy in December 2014, having shed about $7 billion in debt. It was the end of one crisis and the beginning of another, the long work of rebuilding a city that had lost 2/3 of its population and nearly all of its industrial base. What remains of Detroit's auto industry today is a fraction of what it was, but a fraction of something that large is still substantial. The Rouge still operates. GM's Factory Zero, built on the site of the old Hamtramck assembly plant, produces electric vehicles. Stellantis, the company formed from the merger of Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot, maintains significant operations in the region. Suppliers and parts manufacturers employ tens of thousands across southeastern Michigan. The city of Detroit itself, however, has transformed. In 2024, the Census Bureau recorded the city's first population increase in decades. It was modest, just a few thousand people, but it represented something that statistics often miss, a turning point in perception. For the first time since 1950, more people moved into Detroit than moved out. Downtown Detroit, once empty after dark, now has restaurants and apartments and young professionals who chose to live there rather than the suburbs. Neighborhoods that were abandoned are being reclaimed, some through organized revitalization, others through pure stubbornness. The city demolished more than 25,000 abandoned houses over the past decade, removing blight that had festered for generations. 15,000 more have been or are being renovated. Thousands of vacant structures still remain, waiting for decisions about their futures. The Packard plant is mostly gone now. Where it once stood, there are plans for a park, a manufacturing facility, and what city planners optimistically call a vibrant employment center. The railroad spur that once brought materials to the factory still runs through the property. If the plans work, trucks will roll where Packards once did. Whether that happens remains to be seen. The story of Detroit's auto plants is a story about scale, about what happens when a single industry dominates a single place so completely that the two become inseparable, about the wages of success and the price of change, about who builds and who benefits, who stays and who leaves, who bears the cost when the machines stop running. Henry Ford didn't set out to destroy Detroit. He set out to build cars that everyone could afford, he succeeded beyond imagining. The assembly line he invented at Highland Park spread to every factory in every industry in every country on Earth. The world we live in, for better and worse, is a world the assembly line made possible. But the city that birthed that revolution was left behind. The factories Ford built were designed for a world where labor was cheap and land was precious. When those conditions changed, when automation made workers expensive and highways made suburban land accessible, the factories became obsolete. Their replacements rose elsewhere, in the suburbs, in the South, in Mexico, in China. Detroit paid the price not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well at something the world no longer needed in the same way. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1950, Detroit's population was 1.8 million. By 2020, it was 639,000, a loss of nearly two-thirds of its residents over 70 years. In 1950, the city was 84% white. By 2010, it was 11% white. The demographic transformation was total. At its peak, the River Rouge complex employed over 100,000 workers. Today, it employs about 6,000. The Packard plant produced 1.6 million luxury automobiles over half a century. It sat abandoned for nearly as long as it operated. Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, $18 billion in debt. It emerged 17 months later, having cut $7 billion of that. The 2009 auto bailout cost American taxpayers approximately $9.3 billion. It saved over 1 million jobs across the supply chain, according to supporters. Critics argue it rewarded failure. What the numbers don't capture is what it felt like to live through the collapse. The years of uncertainty, the friends and family members who left, the neighborhoods that emptied, the services that failed, the promises that weren't kept. There's a tendency, when discussing Detroit, to speak of the city as a cautionary tale, a warning about deindustrialization, or white flight, or municipal mismanagement, or union excess, or any of the other explanations that commentators offer depending on their politics. But Detroit isn't just a lesson. It's a place where people still live, where children go to school, where small businesses open their doors every morning hoping today will be better than yesterday. The city that invented mass production is now learning slowly what comes after. The assembly lines that once churned out thousands of cars per day are gone or diminished. The workers who staffed them are retired or dead or scattered to the suburbs and beyond. The factories that made them all possible are mostly rubble. What remains is harder to see but perhaps more durable, a stubbornness that refuses to accept the verdict of history, a belief that what was built once can be rebuilt again, differently. The last true Packard rolled off the line in 1956. The plant closed, then reopened for other uses, then closed again, then rotted, then burned, then became a symbol, then became an embarrassment, then became a demolition project, then became a plan for something new. That sequence took nearly 70 years. The Rouge still runs. Model Ts haven't rolled off its line since the 1920s, but F-150 trucks do now. The plant that was designed for total vertical integration, where iron ore arrived at one end and finished cars emerged from the other, has adapted to a world of global supply chains and just-in-time inventory. It's smaller than it was, it's different than it was, but it's still there. Highland Park, where the moving assembly line was born, is now an industrial center with multiple tenants. The Crystal Palace is gone, replaced by nondescript buildings that could be warehouses anywhere. A plaque marks the spot where Ford paid $5 a day and changed what workers could expect from their labor. The factories that defined Detroit for a century are mostly memory now. But memory isn't nothing. It's what we carry forward into whatever comes next. The sun comes up over the Detroit River, the way it has for 3 centuries. The city on the American side is quieter than it was, smaller, but still there. Somewhere, a shift starts at a plant that still makes things. Workers clock in the way workers have always clocked in, trading hours for wages, building something that will travel down roads to people they'll never meet. The assembly line still moves, though the hands that guide it are fewer than they once were. The machines are smarter now. They do things that Henry Ford never imagined, but the basic transaction remains. Raw materials in, finished products out, and human beings in the middle making it happen. Detroit didn't collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because the strength it built was designed for a world that changed, The same efficiency that made the assembly line possible also made the assembly line portable. Once the techniques were standardized, any city with cheap land and willing labor could replicate what Detroit had spent decades perfecting. The tragedy wasn't that Detroit invented modern manufacturing. The tragedy was that manufacturing moved on. What's left now is a city learning to be something other than what it was. The Packard site will become something. Maybe manufacturing, maybe housing, maybe a park where people walk through on summer evenings, not knowing or caring that 40,000 workers once built luxury automobiles on the same ground. The Rouge will keep running until it doesn't. The electric trucks rolling off its lines now would baffle Henry Ford, who hated anything he didn't invent. But his great-great-grandson still runs the company, and the company still makes vehicles, and the vehicles still carry the Ford name. Highland Park is a city within a city, surrounded on all sides by Detroit but politically separate, one of the poorest municipalities in Michigan. The plant that made it famous is a footnote now. Most people who drive past don't know they're passing the birthplace of modern industry. And Detroit itself is what? A cautionary tale to some, a success story to others, a work in progress to most, a city that was built on an industry that consumed it, that rose and fell, and is now trying to rise again on different terms. The factories are mostly gone. The people who staff them are scattered. The cars they built are in museums or junkyards or still rolling down highways, depending on how well they were made. What remains is a city that refuses to accept the story everyone tells about it. That insists it's more than a symbol of decline. That keeps building, even when the assembly lines have stopped. Detroit's population in 2024 showed its first increase since 1957. It's a small number, a statistical flicker, but it's a direction. The factories that once made Detroit great are relics now, most of them. Their replacements are leaner, more automated, less reliant on the masses of workers who once powered them. The middle-class jobs they created, the ones that let a high school graduate buy a house and raise a family and retire with a pension, are harder to find. But they still exist, and the city still exists, and the river still runs past the Rouge, past Belle Isle, out to Lake Erie and beyond. What comes next isn't written yet. If you came to Detroit looking for ruins, you could find them. Empty factories, abandoned houses, lots where buildings used to stand, now returning to prairie. But if you looked harder, you'd find something else. Restaurants opening, neighborhoods stabilizing, young people choosing to stay rather than leave, small manufacturers setting up in spaces that once held giants. The city that invented the assembly line is learning to live without it, not easily, not quickly, but learning. The Packard plant stood for 60 years after the last car rolled off its line. For most of that time, it was a monument to failure, a reminder of what Detroit had lost. Now it's mostly gone, cleared away to make room for whatever comes next. The story isn't over, it's just different now. 3 a.m, fog off the river. The skyline is quieter than it was, but lights still burn in the towers downtown. Somewhere a shift is ending at a plant that still runs. Somewhere else a bar is closing, and the people inside are heading home to sleep before the next day's work. Detroit isn't what it was. It may never be again. But it's still here, still standing, still trying to figure out what comes after the assembly line stops. And that maybe is the only story that matters. The question that opened this film was simple. How does a city that invented the modern world forget how to live in it? The answer is that it didn't forget, it was left behind. The techniques Detroit pioneered, mass production and vertical integration and the moving assembly line, were too powerful to stay in one place. They spread across the world, the way good ideas always do. And as they spread, the advantages Detroit held, its skilled workforce, its established suppliers, its infrastructure, mattered less and less. Other places could build factories too. They could train workers. They could buy machines. What they couldn't buy was history, but history turned out to be less valuable than location and labor costs and tax incentives. Detroit didn't collapse because it was poorly managed, though it was sometimes poorly managed. It didn't collapse because its workers were overpaid, though by some measures they were. It didn't collapse because its products were bad, though for a time they were. Detroit collapsed because the world it built outgrew it. The factories remain as monuments, some restored, most demolished. The workers remain as memory, their contributions absorbed into a global system that no longer needs their specific hands in their specific place. And the city remains as itself, battered, diminished, but stubbornly present, building something new in the shadow of something great. The Packard plant is gone now, mostly. 2 buildings remain, their fate uncertain. The Rouge still runs, smaller than it was, different than it was, but running. Highland Park is a landmark, a plaque, a paragraph in history books. And Detroit is a city of 600,000 people who wake up every morning and go to work and raise their children and live their lives in a place the rest of the world considers a warning. They know something the rest of the world doesn't. That warnings can be wrong, that decline isn't destiny, that a city is more than its factories, more than its products, more than the headlines that describe it from a distance. Detroit was the city that put the world on wheels. The factories that did it are mostly gone. The cars they built are mostly scrapped. The workers who staffed them are mostly dead. But the city remains. And that's the story, not the collapse, not the bankruptcy, not the abandoned buildings or the population graphs or the political debates. The story is that Detroit is still here, still building, still becoming whatever comes next. The assembly line stopped. The city didn't. Somewhere in Detroit, right now, someone is starting a business. Someone is renovating a house. Someone is raising children in a neighborhood their parents abandoned. They're not waiting for permission. They're not waiting for the factories to return. They're building something new in the space the factories left behind. It won't look like what came before. It can't. The conditions that made Detroit the manufacturing capital of the world no longer exist. The rivers of labor and capital and raw material that flowed into this city for a century have found other channels. But other things flow here now. Art, music, ideas. People who choose Detroit not because they have to, but because they want to. The city that invented mass production is learning to value things that can't be mass-produced. The neighborhoods that emptied when the factories closed are filling again with people who see possibility where others see decay. It's slow work. It's uncertain work. There's no assembly line for rebuilding a city. But it's happening, one house at a time, one business at a time, one person at a time. The factories told one story about Detroit. They told a story about what humans could accomplish with machines and organization and relentless efficiency. For half a century, that story was triumphant. For the next half-century, it was tragic. Now a new story is being written. It doesn't have an ending yet. It might not for decades. But the people writing it aren't waiting for the conclusion. They're living in the middle chapters, doing what people always do, working, building, hoping, failing, trying again. Detroit was the city of the future once. Then it became the city of the past. Now it's something else, a city of the present, figuring out what comes next. The factories are mostly silent. The assembly lines are mostly still, but the city is anything but. If you drive through Detroit today, you'll see the ruins. You'll see the empty lots and the boarded windows and the vines growing over walls that once held blueprints for the machines that changed the world. But you'll also see something else. You'll see restaurants filled with people. You'll see houses being repaired. You'll see murals on buildings that were once abandoned, painted by artists who chose to stay. You'll see farmers' markets and coffee shops and small factories making things that didn't exist a decade ago. You'll see a city that refuses to accept the verdict. Detroit was never just its factories. It was the people who worked in them, and the families they raised, and the culture they built, and the stubborn insistence that their city mattered even when the world seemed to disagree. That stubbornness is still here. The factories are mostly gone, but Detroit isn't. And as long as that's true, the story isn't over. The sun sets over the Rouge, the way it has for 100 years. The buildings are different now. The people are different. The cars rolling off the line run on batteries instead of gasoline. But the river still flows. The machines still hum. The workers still clock out at the end of their shifts and drive home through streets that have seen better days and worse ones. Detroit endures. Not as what it was. Nothing is what it was. But as what it is, a city of survivors, building in the ruins, planting in the gaps, refusing to accept that the best days are behind. The assembly line changed the world. Detroit paid the price. Now it's writing a different story. And the ending hasn't been written yet.